Hey, it's Conrad Thompson. Thanks for checking out the podcast here on YouTube. Be sure to hit the subscribe button and the notifications bell. You'll get a notice anytime we upload some new content. And when I'm not asking Bruce, hey, how big was Batista's? Well, you know. One of the things I like to do is help people save money. And if you're watching this video right now and you're in a 30-year loan, man, you're overpaying your single biggest bill and you may not even realize it. I want you to do a little experiment for me. Take your calculator out, multiply your monthly house payment by 360 payments. That's how many payments there are in a 30-year loan. That big scary number, that's your total of payments. You're looking at that number? You know you can do better. Keep more of your own money right now and go to savewithconrad.com. Or maybe you've got credit card debt. Man, it's not a matter of if I can save you money with that. Your average interest rate on a credit card is more than 20%. And by the way, all the interest you pay on those credit cards, it's not tax deductible. Whereas the mortgage interest, well, that is tax deductible. So if you owe this debt, it's up to you how to pay it back. Doesn't it make sense to get the cheapest rate possible and the greatest tax deduction possible? Find out how much money you can save right now for free at savewithconrad.com. You don't need perfect credit. Even scores in the 500s can be approved, and it's no cost out of pocket. But maybe best of all, we're licensed in more than 40 states. We can help more families than ever before. But how much can we save you? Find out right now for free with a quick quote from savewithconrad.com.
Wouldn't it be nice to take a spring break from some house payments? SaveWithConrad.com can show you how to skip your next 2 house payments and get a cheaper monthly payment. We routinely help our podcast listeners save $500, $600, $700, even $800 a month. And I'm talking to you if you're in a 30-year loan or if you've got credit card debt. It's not a matter of if we can save you money. It's a matter of how much. Find out right now for free at SaveWithConrad.com. NMLS number 65084, equal housing lender. And oh, by the way, it's no cost, no obligation. And if I can't save you money, I won't waste your time. Even credit scores in the 500s can be approved, and we're licensed in more than 40 states. So what are you waiting for? Lower your monthly payments today at SaveWithConrad.com. Hey, it's Conrad Thompson, and you're listening to Dark Side of the Podcast. I know you were probably expecting a little Grill and JR content, but each and every Wednesday we sit down with the producers who put together what I think is maybe the most brilliant documentary series in the history of professional wrestling. It comes out Tuesday nights at 10 p.m. on Vice. Of course, we're talking about Dark Side of the Ring. And back with us again today, Evan and Jason. Jason, how you feeling this morning, man? We heard the Snuka story last night.
Yeah, it was, I like followed some of the feedback like on Twitter, and as I expected, it was, it was very populated with, people very intrigued by the story, and, it mustered up a bunch of different reactions. And so I've just been kind of following like how people interpreted the story, since last night.
Evan, how about you? What did you think of the feedback? Is it what you expected?
Well, yeah, I mean, it's definitely provoking a lot of conversation. It's provoking a lot of discussion, about the things that we covered in the story. It seemed like there was a good deal of folks, wrestling fans, that weren't aware of a lot of the details of this case. And so this was kind of the first time some people were really getting to see this laid out in this way. I will say, maybe Jason, if you feel similarly, like watching it back last night, it was sort of the feeling of like, this episode, where the Benoit episode, had to have been 2 parts. There's definitely an argument to be made that the Snuka episode could have been 2 to 3 parts,
Yeah, I absolutely agree. And there's that's one of the things, like when I'm looking at the feedback on Twitter, there's a lot of people who talk about certain things, like people who have researched this story before, who have brought up things like, oh, I wish they would have talked about this. And it's like, yeah, like we would have too. Like there's so much information, that we can only pack into 45 minutes. So we try to hone in on the most important information, but there's just so much of it. You're right. There really could be 3 episodes.
Yeah. And I think that's one important thing to say is, obviously it's kind of a boring detail, but as we're making this show, I mean, we have a format that we have to deliver to. And I think that the Benoit story was a special case where we were allowed if you will, the permission to basically, have a 2-part episode. And so, we have these restrictions of what the confines of what we can work in. And it almost felt like when we were doing this story, I remember just feeling very overwhelmed, because I do believe, I'm not 100%, but I do believe that this is the most people we've ever interviewed for one episode. Yeah. And there's some interviews that didn't make the final cut as well. And that the information was so overwhelming because you're dealing with a story that took place in 1983, and also, that the story comes back in 2013, 30 years after the fact. And so, it was an overwhelming experience to produce this episode, because the fact that there was so much information, and it was like, okay, there's so many different avenues. It's a dense story. It involves a lot of different characters and a lot of different timelines. And it was definitely, I can say, the most challenging episode to put together. And I even remember a couple weeks before we delivered it, feeling like, man, this is tough, Yeah. And hopefully we can get it across the finish line, because it really was, I would say, the most challenging episode for us to put together.
Jason, I'm curious, when you said, and I thought the same thing, I was like, man, I really wish we had more time here. Why is that a decision from Vice, or a call that you guys make to not do 2 episodes on Snuka and instead move to another topic? Because I, like you, sort of think that there was, more to the story, similar to the Benoit episode. And I know you've got some other great stuff coming our way. I think next week is Dino Bravo, and there's Herb Abrams and David Schultz and Owen Hart. And I mean, the Road Warriors, there's a lot of good stuff coming. Why not 2 episodes of Snuka? Was that a Vice call?
I guess it's a little bit of like we came up, like, at first we didn't know at the very beginning just how like deep the story went. And so we pitched these ideas for episodes. We had already, previous to shooting this episode, had been developing the Benoit story, and we had thought maybe that would be a story we would take somewhere else and do multiple episodes of. So it was already in development in such a way that multiple episodes were in mind. Whereas the Snuka episode, that wasn't thought of right off the top. So we kind of, I think, went, into production, finding out so much more like information that we realized, oh man, this really could warrant more episodes. But the episode order has already been in place, and we're already, so far down that road. But yeah, there are multiple episodes. I wish we could have had, some more running time to tell the stories, for sure.
Yeah, and I could just throw onto that too. Just a little bit of background on how this all came together is kind of interesting. In hindsight, looking back, oh my gosh! But when we first pitched the show, Jason, if you remember, in 2016, it was originally pitched as a half-an-hour show.
Yeah,
and to actually think for a minute that is what we were actually doing, it would have been, imagine these as 22-minute episodes. It's impossible. But that was a huge actual part of getting the show greenlit originally, was when we had it at a half an hour. That's what we thought we were we probably would have been covering different stories in that format. It probably would have been, stories that, weren't as dense as these ones that we're talking about now. But when we originally pitched it, they were supposed to be half-hour shows, and I remember there was a point in time where the show, basically, they told us no, because the budget for the half-an-hour version of the show was too great at the time. It was too much money to spend on a half-an-hour show, and I basically audibled to the head of production at the company and just said, well, what if we did these as hour-longs for the same amount of money? Not really thinking that one through. But then they thought that was a compelling business argument. And so then the show was agreed upon that it would be an hour long. And when we were talking about season 2, the people at the network aren't as familiar with these stories that we are. And so I was really telling them, no, that the Benoit story really has to be at least 2 episodes in order for us to tell this story. I mean, it's so massive. And then, I think one of the arguments, they eventually agreed to that being 2 episodes, but one of the counter arguments to that was, well, we really want 10 stories. Like, we want to have 10 different stories for season 2. So that was what they had ordered. And then it was kind of like when I had went back and said, well, wait a minute, this is one of the bigger stories in wrestling. If we're going to cover it, we're going to need 2. And obviously for us to do 10 and a half episodes or whatever, that's just too much work, for the amount of time that we get to make all of these, because we're making all of these episodes in a 9-month period is how long we spent making 10 of these. So basically they want 10 different stories for season 2, or that's what they wanted. And they got 9 this time. So I think to have gone back and to have, taken another story out, it would have been an argument. I don't know if we would have won, but going back to the original point, this story definitely, and we have the materials probably in order to do it, is that there's so much information there on this story, which we're going to be getting into. And that's why, I want to thank you for giving us this opportunity to do this podcast, because I think we can kind of get into some of the information that we just didn't have the runtime to actually, talk about.
Well, Jason, before we get into sort of some of the stuff that didn't make air, talk to me a little bit about the challenges of doing a story like this where, I don't mean to be dismissive, but it's definitely a different feel from last week's episode. It feels like the New Jack episode, as gruesome as some of the violence was, that was a departure from Benoit, and then Dark Side of the Ring was a departure from all of that. And now we're sort of right back in line with a Bruiser Brody or Benoit sort of murder mystery, for lack of a better word. This is some heavy stuff. And this time it involves sort of wrestling royalty. What challenges does this present? Because some of this stuff, if you're not familiar with the story, it's pretty jarring.
Yeah. There were definitely a few challenges. One of the challenges was just getting people to talk about it. There were a few people who declined to be interviewed about this subject. But you're right. It is this deals with somebody who, was so highly regarded, in the wrestling world. Even myself, I was such a fan growing up. I had his LGN figure. I had his Hasbro figure, I was definitely a fan of his. So it does, there is a feeling about it that is that is, depressing in the sense of going down the rabbit hole about someone that you admired and, finding out some things that are kind of questionable, but also doing we're doing our best to do our due diligence to tell all sides of this story. But it's funny you mentioned the Bruiser Brody story. In some ways, all these episodes kind of go back to Bruiser Brody, and the fact that the kind of the spark of the idea of this episode came from an interview, the very first interview we did for the show, which was an interview with Tony Atlas, where I think it was kind of near the end of our interview, we're just talking about other stories, and that he had mentioned that that he was dating a girl at the time of during the time of Nancy Argentino's death. And he remarked that she was his ex-girlfriend at the time was privy to some incidents between Snuka and Nancy Argentino. And I think Evan, that just really stuck with you through the course of making the seasons.
Yeah, no, yeah. What it was is we were doing the interview with Tony Atlas in 2017, and this was months after Jimmy passed away. And so it was still a very fresh story for wrestling fans at the time. So I think when I can't remember exactly in the interview when it was, but he casually mentioned that his ex-wife actually, because he was married to her, right. It was actually Tony's first wife that that he had, and she, according to Tony, and this has never been verified in any way or at all, but he would tell a story that basically she was friends with Nancy Argentino, and she did witness some physical abuse on the night that she died, and that I remember. I filed that away. When I heard that in 2017 when we interviewed him for Bruiser Brody, I remembered that and was if we ever tell this story someday, I'm going to follow up on this lead and see if this is really true. And so For season 1, the Jimmy Snuka story was not really in our plans per se. Again, like going back to talking about how the Chris Benoit story was kind of in our plans for season 1, but again, it was just something we weren't ready to tell. It's kind of, I would say, the same for this. And then, of course, we found out that there was a documentary that was trying to be made on this subject matter that was shut down by a gag order that was placed on the Argentino family during the trial, when it came back into trial. And so that might have still been in effect. I'm not sure. But anyway, when we came down to season 2, and we had sent out a note on social media that was, hey, viewers, what stories do you want to see us cover? I think that the Snuka story ranked probably in the top 4 of the stories that people wanted us to cover. So, we obviously took that seriously and started to look into it. And that was when I had the memory of Tony saying that. And so one of the first things that we did is we actually tried to track her down. And Tony has lost, this is his ex-wife, his first wife. I think they split up in the late 80s, I want to say, if memory serves me correctly. And so he hasn't been in contact with her at all for many, many years. And so, he only had her name, and we basically found Tony's marriage license that he had at one period in time to try and find any more information. We got her name, but we found out that her name was one of the most common. I think she was Puerto Rican, but she was from New York City, and she's a very common name. So it made it really hard to try and track her down, but we did. We cold called I don't know, a few dozen people to try and, say, hey, were you in Allentown in 1983, and try and figure out this story to see if we could find, someone who allegedly was a witness to something. So, unfortunately that didn't wind up going anywhere, but that was basically the first step that we took into kind of putting this together. And then it just, from there, this whole thing was just a wild ride of, a lot of information. It's a dizzying amount of information and a lot of paperwork. And we're going to get into some of that because it is fascinating looking at the original paperwork from the case in 1983. So we can talk about that. But yeah, this story for us was one of the bigger undertakings of the season for sure.
Jason, when you watched it back last night, what was your takeaway when you visited with the former chief of police? It feels like social media had a field day with him. And of course, social media, everyone is an expert. And so everyone's like, oh, he's biting his lip or he's looking up. He's definitely lying. I don't think there's a lot of people who would worry about playing poker with him. What did you think watching the episode back last night?
Yeah, I did see a couple of those comments where people are like, he's looking up. That's a sign of he's lying. And I'm like, I don't know if there's any truth to that, but I feel, he's definitely in a difficult position to defend things that happen in memories of people from 30 years ago. But it's been interesting to see how people reacted to him. It's a difficult thing for I imagine for him to have to defend some of the work of his
staff.
Time. Yeah.
Yeah. One of the things I'll add on to that too is while this was also, I think, probably the most people we interviewed for one episode and talked to, it's also the episode that has the most people that declined to be interviewed, I think, out of any episode that we've ever done too. So this is just such a hot button controversial story. And, we did reach out to the investigating detectives, the guys who originally investigated the case in 1983. Most of the hospital staff that was there on the night that Nancy passed away. The original investigating detectives that covered this case, all the medical personnel that was in the emergency room the night that Nancy passed away, and the coroner and other medical examiners declined to be interviewed, and both of the district attorneys, past and present. So there was a challenge to find people to really speak about this, who were on that side of the story. So we had, Frederick, who is the chief of police at the time. He agreed to participate. And then, of course, you have the paramedic, Shirley, who, was first on the scene as a medical personnel. And so we're thankful to be able to have that perspective, but clearly there's other perspectives that, definitely could have been in the story. And so I do think that, Frederick was our closest. The chief of police was our closest that we could get to somebody who was involved in the investigation. But, he's not somebody that was in the field, on the ground conducting these interviews. And, as which we'll get into here in a second when we look at some of these interviews. But so I think, to Jason's point, he was in a difficult position to basically look at a case. Well, that was this 30 plus years ago, and to basically have to comment on behalf of his staff. And then of course the issue of the third man in the car is obviously another provocative aspect of this story too, that we weren't expecting to,
well, let's talk about that in a minute. I do want to ask, and then we'll move on. Why in the world would Frederick agree to participate in this? Like, I'm not saying that to be funny, but it feels like a no-win situation for him, and he comes off looking terrible in the process. Does he not?
Well, he didn't. I can't really answer, why he. Because I'm not sure, in terms of what his thought process was into agreeing to it. But to him, I can say honestly that he didn't look at this case. He basically looked at this case and thought that it was investigated to the best of its ability. He did, obviously, again, you don't have runtime to get into these type of things, but he did talk about, other cases that he's worked on in the past, and some other cases where he was suspect of police corruption, and he has arrested cops before, and he has put his fellow cops behind bars and things like that. So he's also someone that went on to, I think, help form the TSA after 9/11. And so he's dealt with big events, big stories, and big other cases that he was telling us about. And to him, I think he looks at this case and looks back on it and says, well, we investigated to the best of our ability. And, he's there to basically challenge certain aspects of it. I mean, he says, to his opinion, we couldn't, just because somebody tells different stories doesn't mean they're guilty, and then he talks about how the medical examiners didn't find certain evidence, and then he was kind of speaking on behalf of what a defense attorney would say, poking holes in the autopsy report. So I'm not exactly sure why he agreed to it, but I think that he was very confident in the work that his staff did on this case. So we just felt like it was important to get that perspective.
Let's talk about, you mentioned some other folks who had maybe passed on the opportunity to participate. The post show featured Greg the Hammer Valentine and Brian Knobs from the Nasty Boys. And I don't know. I felt like Irv Mushnick got on there and had some really pointed opinions, and obviously he is an expert, and I couldn't understand what the point of having, and I know it's not necessarily you guys' show, but I do want to comment on the post show because I feel like it was a hot topic last night with Greg the Hammer Valentine and Nasty Boy, Brian Knobs. I don't think either one of them were there, but they did know Jimmy and obviously had a relationship with him. Jason, what'd you think of the post show?
I don't know. I haven't seen it. Because I live in Canada, that post show only plays in the States. So I can't see it. So I don't know. I don't know really how it went down. Yeah. And,
to be clear, obviously, the After Dark program is a program that isn't produced by us, and
right.
Has no, connection to our staff at all. I will say that I do think it was weird that, Irv Mushnick was given such little time. I didn't watch all of it either. I was kind of like, I was more paying attention to the reaction on social media than I probably was on the After Dark show. But I can't explain their thought process in terms of putting them on the show. I think that, in terms of Greg the Hammer and Brian Knobs, obviously, I think it is a little peek into how other wrestlers do look at Jimmy, and I think that's not necessarily, a bad thing for, people who aren't as inundated as wrestling as all of us on this call are, to see. But yeah, I definitely think you know, and I'm not trying to throw them under the bus, but you know, if Jason and I think we're in the driver's seat of that show, I think, you know, we would have probably gotten different guests.
Well, just the whole approach was very, oh, those were crazy times. I mean, it just felt a little tone deaf to me. Like, hey, we just talked about a lady losing her life, and now we're high-fiving, telling stories about the good old days. And it was just, what the fuck are we doing? I don't know. It just didn't feel like those folks had just watched the same thing I had.
Yes. I agree. I agree. I think I was just going to say, I think that, you know, again, I think it does kind of speak to, in a disturbing way, how, you know, maybe some of these guys do look at this, you know, I mean, cause look, I mean, this story is about, you know, a life that was basically discarded, and somebody that, you know, back in 1983 didn't feel like was important, you know? And I do think that, you know, seeing that kind of, seeing that perspective on display there, you know, is something that is, I think, even though I think a lot of wrestling fans, it may be like, well, you know, why do they do this? Why do they do that? But I mean, it is part of the perspective that's existed in this business for a while. Don't you think?
Yeah, for sure. I mean, I can't discount that. I don't know. It just didn't feel like it was sort of on the same page with the presentation of the show. But one of the big parts of the show that they did have a chance to beat up a little bit in the After Dark show is the different versions of the story that have gone around regarding Nancy's passing. And we heard what Brian Knobs had said or heard, which was, you know, she fell in the shower. And then I think Snuka has had two versions out of his own mouth, where he said she fell on the side of the road, which we'll talk about in a moment, I'm sure. And then there was some sort of an altercation, some sort of physicality. And that wasn't the first time they had some physicality, and you guys sort of set the stage for that in Syracuse. There's just so much to unpack here. I guess we'll start first with the most prominent alibi that he had always put out there, which was she slipped using the restroom on the side of the road. She jumped over a stream or something and hit a wet rock, and she hit her head on the side of the road. And it's revealed almost accidentally by Tonga Kid, who didn't even remember Nancy's name, that didn't happen. They were all in the car together, and they didn't stop, and she didn't pee on the side of the road, and she didn't slip and fall. And then he just says, and then they, you know, when we got to the hotel, I went to my room, they went to their room where she was killed. And maybe that was a slip of the tongue, but even the way he phrased it wasn't she passed away or the incident happened or whatever. That's where she was killed. When you guys were filming that, Jason, are you just looking at each other like, did we just stumble across what we think we did here?
I think there's a little bit, like, you know, you're a little bit confused as to like what's going on. Like, I wasn't there for that particular interview. So Evan would be able to speak more to it, but I've watched, like, you know, I've sat there and I've watched the whole interview. Fine. But, you know, I will say there's, you know, there's like, I think the way like Carol Snuka's last wife of 20 years, she talks about how, you know, some of these memories that people have and some of the wrestlers from like 30 years ago can be like, they can be like foggy to a degree. And so, and that is something that, you know, through the course of making the show, you know, we have seen, and something we have to be wary of, is that like a lot of these stories get compacted on over the years, and the wrestlers have heard stories and the bad things to stories. And so it's sometimes hard to like kind of decipher what is true. And sometimes I think even the wrestlers, you know, have a hard time grasping with like what, you know, what was the truth or what they remember in some way.
Yeah. That interview was definitely one of the more wilder experiences I think I've had on this show, in terms of like, really, that was a completely unexpected piece of information, at least in regards to, him possibly being in the car that day was something I wasn't anticipating. And really, the thought process behind getting Tonga Kid involved in the episode was basically, he was Jimmy Snuka meant a lot to him.
Yeah.
Basically, Tonga Kid, Jimmy Snuka was his mentor. I mean, Jimmy took him under his wing, and Tonga Kid was very passionate and very emotional when the case came back, when the case resurfaced and Jimmy was being charged. He was very vocal about it on the internet, and I think we had seen that and sort of felt like that his emotion towards Jimmy and being kind of a defender of him is an important voice to get in there, and especially because of that relationship that they had, really kind of shows that. So that was the thought process, and
he was one of the few who were there in Allentown.
Oh yeah,
and so that we did our best to try and track down whoever was there at that motel the night of the events. So yeah, he was there.
Yeah, it's actually one of the more sobering things is looking at the cards, looking at the actual matches around that time, and then really seeing that, wow, a lot of these guys aren't with us anymore, right. From back in 1983. There's a lot, and we did talk to some folks who were there that didn't remember much, or didn't know really anything. And, so that when we said on previous episodes of this podcast, is you have a set budget. You can only interview so many people. And so we felt like, it worked because, Tonga was there and because, he had that relationship to Jimmy. And so anyway, long story short, we did the interviews with him and with Fred, the police chief in Las Vegas. One of the things that we do sometimes when we're on the road, mainly for budgetary reasons, is sometimes we'll fly people into one town, so we can just basically come into one town and we can shoot as many interviews on the same day without having to literally fly around the country and bounce all over the place. It just makes it more economic. So we figured that we could kind of meet in the middle in Las Vegas. I think we were interviewing Godfather also on that trip, and he lives there for a different story, obviously. And so we had this Airbnb and we show up. So before we start rolling, Tonga Kid walks in, Sam Fatu. He walks in and he's basically talking about how, he's excited because finally his side of the story is going to be told. The Tonga Kid story is going to be, people will see his side of the story. And so I'm kind of intrigued by what that's going to be. And so we sit down and we do the interview, and he goes from talking about how much Jimmy meant to him, and it was very emotional. It was really one of the more emotional interviews we did, just about how much he meant to him. And then we get to the part about Allentown, and things definitely get uncomfortable in the interview. But he was telling us that he was there in the motel, the George Washington Motor Lodge. He saw the ambulances pull up. He saw Jimmy leaning up against the police car. But then, I asked him the question of, well, how did you get to Allentown? What was the start of your day? And he basically starts telling us that he drove there to the motel with Jimmy and Nancy. And from the statements that Jimmy's given that, his story starts with them driving into town and going to the motel. And so I kind of was in my mind, blindsided by that, because nowhere in any of the case files, nowhere in any reporting that's been done on this story before does it say that there could have been or it was another person in the car. I want to be clear about that. So for me, it was kind of just a bizarre interview moment that I wasn't anticipating at all that would happen. So I also wanted to be very careful about just to make sure that he wasn't misspeaking or that he wasn't confused about a different time. And so I had him go over the story, I would say 2 to 3 times, in terms of what day are we talking about? And then, that's when he said the night she was killed. And that was the word that he chose. I wouldn't read into that too much, just based on the way that, he uses vocabulary in the other bits of the interview.
Yeah.
But, he does, but, I went back and really made sure that he was talking about that particular time, because I didn't want it to be this thing where we kind of got you in a moment and then just like, breezed over it and saved it for later, whatever. Like I wanted to be sure that I gave him all the opportunities to make to confirm that this is what he's talking about. And then of course it became clear when he was talking about that he wasn't that familiar with what Jimmy's story was to the authorities about her falling alongside of the road, and so that also was an awkward thing. And then it was time for the chief of police to do his interview, and like I was mentioning, it was in the same location, and he was just showing up, and the chief of police comes in, he sits down, and he starts going into his interview, and then he says something about, I can't remember exactly what it was right now, but he said something about like that, made a very brief mention that there could have been somebody else in the car. Like he brought it up on his own. And then our camera person, Dan, who is one of our camera guys that travels with us on the road, fantastic guy, and we'd be lost without him. He picked up on that because he was really invested in this story the whole time we were doing it, and actually asked Fred if we could go back to when you were mentioning earlier in the interview about a potential third person in the car, and then that's when I was like, oh yeah. It's interesting because the person that was here before you, and then obviously Fred says he was in the car, and I said, well, yeah, it says he was in the car, and it's just crazy that it's this, the person that was just sitting in that, in the same house, and he was obviously blindsided by that, but he does say that like he had heard that along the way somewhere, and it's very compelling because now it throws everything into the air a little bit. If that were true, obviously that's not good for Jimmy's story if Tonga Kid didn't see what Jimmy was alleging. But again, it's just one of those things that just shows the complexity of the story and shows that so much of this is based on memory. And, Tonga Kid wasn't interviewed in 1983 about this, and when I mentioned it to Carol Snuka during our interview, because I mentioned it to, I think, everybody that we interviewed, I almost want to say almost everybody we interviewed for this episode, I mentioned that Tonga Kid says he was in the car. Nobody had heard anything about that before, and Carol strongly believed that that Tonga Kid had it confused and was actually talking about the Syracuse incident, which happened 4 months prior. But then after hearing that, I went back to the transcripts and I just of our interview, and you can see that I asked him several times about like what day are we talking about, and he was very clear about George Washington Motor Lodge, the night that she died. We drove into Allentown. So I don't know. It's one of those things where I don't know what to believe anymore.
Evan, let me ask, I know this is a weird thing to even bring up, but there's a lot of feedback that was not necessarily positive with Snuka's widow, where she said, I don't think these wrestlers are lying. They just don't remember. And there is something to be said about, it was 30 years ago or more than that. 37 years ago. And we've got guys who have lived a long time and they're getting up there in age, and they've had their fair share of bumps and knocks along the way. And perhaps some of that stuff does get confused. I could see how that would happen. But then I also know that there is the aspect of, for a lot of these guys, this is sort of one last time in the spotlight. Like, I found it a little odd given the topic and the content of the show. Tonga Kid was promoting his appearance on social media yesterday. Like, hey, don't forget, check me out on Vice tonight. And I don't know, some of it just is very fascinating to see it come together, because on the one hand, does Tonga Kid think, well, hey, this is what they want me to say. I'm a performer. And so if you're going through and you explain, oh, it was at the George Washington Motor Lodge, and then later he says, oh yeah, it was at the is that, how much of that do you think is just when the red light is on, hey, here's my chance? Do you think that plays into this at all?
Well, just going back to what I was saying, like I wanted to be sure that that's not what was happening, because we are talking about something very this is a very, this is a serious discrepancy in the story now. So I really wanted to be careful to make sure that, he's not confused in this moment. And that was really important to me. One thing that I noticed last night when I was preparing for today's show was I was looking on the internet, and I just was curious. I don't know why it didn't dawn on me before, but I was like, when did the Tonga Kid start working for the WWF? Because obviously that would lend us a little bit more into, could he have been in that car in that time, or could he be confused about a different event?
Right.
And I actually noticed that the very first that I'm seeing, maybe someone can correct me, but I just, doing a Google search here, I found out that Tonga Kid's first appearance at the WWF is as Samoan number 4, and it actually is on Monday, May 2nd, 1983. In East Hartford, Connecticut, which is 8 days before Nancy dies.
So there was literally no chance for him to confuse it with the Syracuse incident, if the data you found is correct.
I don't know, because the other thing that he did mention in his interview was, Jimmy did take him under his wing, and, he really did show him the ropes. And so, he could have traveled with Jimmy, as just a subordinate, or as an apprentice, not been on the cards.
Yeah.
But at least he is in the company at this time. And then if you look at who else is on, some of these cards, it's kind of like, well, maybe you could deduce that who else would he have ridden with, but you do see that, you have Afa on some of these cards too. So I don't know, there's no way we'll know, I guess.
Well, I do feel like something that, you guys explored a little bit in the Chris Benoit story, because we had the information, and maybe we don't hear it with Jimmy Snuka. And Lord, I'm not trying to make an excuse here. I'm just trying to follow up on something that Snuka's widow said. I mean, Jimmy probably had CTE, right?
I mean,
we're just freestyling guessing.
I can tell you as a fact, she's, her name is, part of the concussion lawsuit,
right,
that was against the WWE. So you'd assume so.
Well, I just don't think it's that far of a stretch when you think about, he's coming off the top rope all these years. He's taken some pretty fantastic bumps, and he did it for decades. And, back in the day, we just didn't know what we know about head trauma now. And we didn't know what we know about concussions, and it was just one of those, you got your bell rung. I mean, that was the phrase back in the day, and you just get back out there, no big deal. And now we know differently. And I'm not saying that played a role or a factor in anything. It was just interesting that because his family, allowed that process to happen, sort of post-mortem, we know that Chris Benoit did. We don't exactly know, but we do know that a judge deemed him not fit for trial, and he passed away 10 days later. And one of the other things that stuck out and got a lot of people talking last night is sort of the similarities between this story and O.J. Simpson, because O.J. had some domestic violence issues, and then there was the trial. Ultimately, he's not found guilty, but he does lose a personal lawsuit and has a huge judgment levied against him, similar to the whole Snuka thing. Jason, when you saw last night social media just blow up, sort of drawing a comparison to the O.J. Simpson story and the Jimmy Snuka story, had you ever even considered that before social media last night?
I honestly, I hadn't, no. But I mean, there is some interesting parallels there. I mean, just because it's, celebrity involved, domestic violence, patterns of abuse, and how this situation is looked at, over time. Yeah, there are some similarities.
Well, let's talk about the domestic abuse piece of this, because the other thing that I think a lot of folks sort of keyed in on, and then it got some more conversation going, is Snuka's relationship with Buddy Rogers. And supposedly there's a lot of information out there that Buddy Rogers was a neighbor of Jimmy Snuka's, and Rogers' wife was friendly with Snuka's wife. And supposedly just a handful of months after Nancy dies, Snuka's wife has an incident with Jimmy and allegedly winds up in the hospital. And it just seems like a pattern in Jimmy's life in this era. And we also are told that, you know, Rogers sort of washes his hands of riding with Jimmy and sort of being his handler because he was so reckless with drug use. Was that something that you guys explored a little more and it just wound up on the cutting room floor?
Yeah, I mean, you know, we definitely had heard that, and it was trying to get, you know, people to talk about, to be able to talk about that. And I mean, again, yeah, it's just another facet of the story that, you know, yeah, just more further proof of showing how much this, how big this story really is and how much more there is to really tell. I mean, as far as the domestic abuse stuff, I mean, which we'll get into here with the story with Nancy, I mean, you know, that was mainly the focus. You know, I know in talking to the Argentinos too, that around the time of the original investigation, or at least maybe the wrongful death suit. Oh no, I'm sorry. I stand corrected. I think it was when they were gearing up for this case reopening that they were reached out to by somebody else who had alleged that there was domestic abuse, as well. You know, I think it was another girlfriend he had.
Yeah,
but, you know,
they referred to her as like a mystery woman or something.
Yeah, it was a mystery woman, and they had photographs of her, but they didn't know her name, and it was like this, you know, something that came out of the woodwork. And yeah, so there were other people that had started to come forward, I think, that were probably going to be part of this if had it gone to trial. So yeah, I mean, there's definitely much more to this story to look into.
Let's talk about the Syracuse incident, because I feel like that, that's sort of a precursor of what's to come. I mean, I think, it was classified by some Snuka defenders as it was, I don't know, a nervous hotel clerk, I think is the phrase that was used. But supposedly it's just absolute mayhem to the point that, you know, people are running naked down the hall screaming for their life. And it takes supposedly 8 different police officers and a police dog to subdue
9.
Okay. A ton of folks here to get Jimmy under control. And then ultimately he gets off scot-free. How much of that did you guys examine, and what did you find, and why did you think that was such a critical thing to include in the story before we get to the event where Nancy ultimately lost her life?
Well, if you'd like, I can read, the sheriff deputy's written statement about it. Where we can get into that if you like. We can transition now into that if you'd like.
Sure.
But I do want to say before we do get into the Syracuse part of the story, is that it really is, you know, a very disturbing point in this story where there is a crossroads. And essentially, you know, had the charges against Jimmy Snuka, had those, you know, had they stuck on him, one tends to think that how things would have happened differently, you know? And so, it is definitely one of the more troubling aspects of the story, and something that we really wanted to include, because not only does it show that there is documentation of physical abuse between them, but also that, you know, there was an opportunity that he was going to suffer some harsh consequences, from this. You know, and of course one tends to think how that would change the course of history. So it is an important thing to look at. So this is, basically the first documented incident that there's anything, you know, crazy stuff happening in Jimmy's hotel room. So the sheriff deputy gives a written statement, and I'll just start reading from it essentially here. It says, upon arriving in the hallway of the motor lodge, I observed a white male with an extremely large muscular build. That's Jimmy Snuka. Standing in the hallway with no clothes on. I heard a woman screaming in a room near number 1. I observed this woman who was covered only by a sheet. She was screaming hysterically, screaming that she wanted to get away from the male. The naked male was later learned to be Jimmy Snuka, and the female was learned to be Nancy Argentino. I learned that they were boyfriend and girlfriend. Then the sheriff deputy says that he saw, quote, Jimmy Snuka forced Nancy Argentino back into the room, that he refused to stop. When they asked him several times to stop and talk, he closed the door. They put their flashlight between the door and the door frame. It says, Snuka became very angered at this and became threatening. He appeared intoxicated and very, very angry. They called for assistance. Snuka stood at the door with Nancy behind him and refused to let her out as she pleaded to be let out. And then he refused to let the police in. He started to struggle, quote, he started to struggle with us. He slammed Sergeant Brown's head against the wall. Another detective used a nightstick to put a chokehold on Snuka, and Snuka continued to resist arrest. They were able to get one handcuff on Snuka's right wrist, and then 3 other officers tried to complete the handcuffing, and then 2 officers used their respective canine dogs in an attempt to control Snuka. He continued to fight, and it took much effort to subdue him. It says, quote, he's a very strong individual. After several minutes of fighting and struggling, he was subdued. He refused to let us put clothes on him other than his underwear. So, yeah, and then eventually he's arrested, and, you know, some of the police in the incident suffer injury. I think one of the police officers was bitten by one of the dogs. And they had some other minor injuries, and Snuka was bit twice, once in the right thigh and once in the left thigh. And this apparently had no effect on him. And he was arrested, booked, and he's in jail and on $5,000 bail. And then, as we know, this really led to no real consequences for Snuka other than apologizing to the authorities and making a donation to charity, which we covered in the show, the Ronald McDonald House. And, you know, when the wrongful death suit took place, which was a few years after Nancy passed away, you know, all of this material was going to be put into that lawsuit in order to basically paint the picture of, you know, that there was violence in their past. And, you know, one of the things also that's interesting in looking at this is that the Jimmy Snuka's attorney at the time, you know, let's see, basically wrote a letter to authorities saying, if you'd like me to read, his attorney said, Jimmy Snuka is a law-abiding individual. Jimmy Snuka, he has great respect for law enforcement authorities. I believe that the incident of which I speak has created a very negative impression, which is unwarranted and extremely unfortunate. Mr. Snuka is sincerely remorseful over this entire matter and wishes to demonstrate in some manner of his attitude of respect and goodwill towards law enforcement. Consequently, at the urging of my client, I have arranged for a benefit wrestling match whereby the proceeds would be designated to a charity which was recommended by Sheriff Dillon. The charity, the Ronald McDonald House, will receive the entire proceeds of Mr. Snuka's purse at the end of his wrestling match on April 7th, 1983. In addition, and more particularly with respect to Mr. Snuka's attitude towards the deputies involved in his arrest, my client wishes to make a formal and public apology for the behavior which he has exhibited on January 18th, 1983. Mr. Snuka intends to make this apology before the public at the time of his wrestling match in Syracuse at the War Memorial at April 7th, 1983. In all honesty, this man bears no grudge against anyone involved in this incident. He recognizes his behavior was quite out of control and is inconsistent with his normal behavior when visiting the numerous areas in this country where he performs as a professional wrestler. And following that, the authorities essentially write a response and feel like he actually is deserving of charges. And they're like, we don't want a public apology and we don't want to be part of one. And they definitely don't want any tickets reserved for them at the April 7th wrestling match and would not attend. And if Snuka wants to donate money to a local charity, you know, then they don't want to be any part of it because they're not against the donation. That it just shouldn't be tied in with this case. And so essentially there's evidence in these documents that suggests that deputies were wanting to get these charges to stick. And one of the ways that he was able to enter into a plea deal in order to get these charges, which were assault in the third degree, you know, a felony charge, to get them to reduce down to harassment, as we covered in the episode last night, was Nancy's affidavit, where, you know, she talks about how this is basically a big misunderstanding. And I can read just a little bit from that because that's also something that's not in the episode as specific, but she says, Nancy's handwritten note says, one of the charges pending against Jimmy S. Snuka is that of assault in the third degree. This charge is said to be a result of an assault upon me by Jimmy Snuka. I wish to state that he never struck me or intentionally harmed me in any way on January 18th, 1983, nor at any other time in the past. I believe the entire matter got out of hand, and that under the circumstances, the differences between Mr. Snuka and the police department could have been settled without any need of an arrest. I see no recourse against the county sheriff's department or any other law enforcement agency for the events which occurred as described herein. So, after that, Snuka makes a plea deal with authorities and with help from Nancy, who's the victim of the assault charge, and signing this affidavit that she does not seek prosecution, that helps him essentially get a lower charge.
What do you, this is so different than the other stories you've covered. A, because it's older, and B, because unlike with the Brody situation, there is a lot of police documentation. Do you remember anything else sort of jumping out at you? Are there any regrets, I guess, when you look back at what was presented last night within the time constraints that you had? Because we don't see a lot of we see some of the folks who worked on the story flipping through these pages, but this just feels like there's so much more to this story.
Yes, absolutely. It's worthy of a book. It's worthy of, of so much, in terms of separating this out. It was the subject of many articles, in the Morning Call newspaper. It's the subject of Irv Munchnick's book, and still we're finding that there's more information, if Tonga Kid's in the car, if he's not, and what you brought up about, the domestic abuse towards his wife. And it's just, the story keeps going and going and going. One thing that was tough to fit into the 44-minute runtime is just literally a rundown of the different stories that he told. Obviously it's summarized, for the sake of the piece, in terms of, that the stories he told that night were, prior to being interviewed by the police, he mentions several different varying stories of, what had happened that, what caused her injuries. And I can just read you the statements that these individuals, these witnesses, gave to the detectives who investigated the case originally, if you like.
Sure.
Okay. So the very first account of what happened that night comes from the responding police officer at 12:15 a.m. on May 11th, 1983. Excuse me. And he writes in his report, quote, "Upon my arrival, I found the victim on the bed gasping for air. Snuka stated to this officer that he and the victim were fooling around outside the room door when he pushed the victim and she fell, striking her head." So that's the very first thing that's said at 12:15 a.m. Now, the next statement that he would make comes at 1:24 a.m. So roughly, just a little over an hour later, from two nurses. It's a joint statement that they're being interviewed by one of the detectives. And they say, quote, the detective, this is quoted from his notes on the interview. He says, "They were on duty in the emergency room when the victim was transported in. One of the nurses attempted to talk to Jimmy Snuka, but stated he just stood there in one spot and stared at the victim. They asked for more info on the victim and heard the following statement. They stated they came into town last night," meaning Jimmy and Nancy. "They came into town late last night. They both were very tired. Jimmy stated they got into an argument, stated he pushed her and she fell back and hit her head. This was stated when he first entered the emergency room." The next comes from the ER doctor, who at 6:50 a.m. on May 11th, 1983, said, this is from the detective's notes, quote, "He worked in the emergency room when the victim was brought in. Stated he briefly talked with Snuka as to what occurred. He said they were fooling around, pushing and shoving outside of the motel room. Snuka stated when he pushed the victim, she fell, striking the back of her head. Stated victim lost consciousness. Snuka stated he picked up the victim by upper arms and she came to. Stated they went into the room and went to sleep. Stated next AM, he began fooling around again with the victim. Light slaps on the face. Stated they went back to sleep. He got up around 12 noon and went to work. Stated later in the evening, he called for medical assistance after he came home. The ER doctor states that Snuka appeared genuinely concerned for the condition of the victim. The same ER doctor was actually called again at 12:45 p.m. that day, which would have been after the police interviewed Jimmy Snuka, which we'll get to. And he says, And he basically asked him to see if he remembered anything else. And the ER doctor said he could not remember anything else that was different or contrary to what he originally told this officer this morning. But basically, Snuka and the victim were fooling around, as they did on many occasions, and the victim was pushed and fell backwards and struck her head. He is not sure if Snuka said it was inside or outside the room at a gas station or something. And then we have the hotel chaplain. This is at 2:30 p.m. on the following day, May 12th, 1983. This is a re-interview of what I have when she talked with Snuka. He told her they were on the road to go to the bathroom. Then this is the first time that this is kind of brought up, the idea of a bathroom scenario. She then assumed it was at a service station. The victim and Snuka started clowning around like he usually did. Snuka shoved the victim with his forearm, and she fell backwards on her back and hit her head on the concrete. She was out for a minute or two, and Snuka admitted to slapping her in the face a few times to bring her out of it. When they arrived at the George Washington Motor Lodge, the victim said she had a headache and wanted to go to bed. She wasn't hungry, but Snuka was. He went to a diner for some food and brought it back to the room. Snuka told the chaplain that the victim passed out in the room and hit her head on the side of a chair or a bed, so that there's another fall that occurs in the room. And he kept checking on her, and she was breathing okay. Snuka went to work in the afternoon and came back later. He went back in the evening for some tapings. When he came back to the room around 9 p.m., yellow stuff was coming out of her nose and mouth. He knew something was obviously wrong, and he called for help. The chaplain also assisted Snuka in making calls to the victim's mother after Nancy's death. And then the deputy coroner is interviewed also on May 11th, and he spoke with the medical chaplain and reiterated basically that's the same story, that they were driving into Allentown area, stopped at a gas station. They both got out of the car, had some sort of argument, and Snuka hit the victim with a forearm, sending her sprawling on her back, and she hit her head on the ground. And there you have the evolution of what is said that night.
It's way down the rabbit hole. There's just so much more meat on the bone. I guess we'd be remiss if we didn't say that, you know, there's at least two other things I think we should cover. One of which is, Nancy's family. You know, I feel like this is one of the sadder stories we're going to cover because, you know, they met Jimmy and thought he was maybe a questionable character, and learned after the fact that he was married and, you know, maybe a drug user. And then, you know, the whole Syracuse incident happens, and fast forward a few months and Nancy's gone way too young, and they try to chase justice as best they can. And it feels like the police sort of position it one way, but then they find out through the documents that it's even said, you know, potential that maybe this was a mate situation
In the autopsy report.
Yeah. It's really challenging for them to sort of get their arms around it. And then they allege that they got a phone call from Vince. Like, this is just a horrific story, and it's a no-win situation for them. How does the topic of, you know, mate abuse, did you guys discuss that it was in the paperwork with them? And then my second part about them is, how did the whole Vince McMahon thing come up on their end?
Well, you know, the Argentino family, obviously has been through a lot, and, you know, they have been chasing justice on this story for so long. I mean, that's a huge part of this story and what it really is kind of about at the end of the day. And the real lack of closure, which is becoming a theme in Dark Side of the Ring, is that lack of closure for so many families in these stories. You know, because this case, you know, because there were no charges filed in 1983, and you know, you hear the Argentino family talk about how the authorities alluded to them at one point back then that they were basically ruling this as an accident.
Right.
You know, that feels very helpless, I'm sure. And then when they do, you know, the Argentino family they hired private investigators, and they had an attorney, and they were putting together that wrongful death suit. And actually, one thing that Carol Snuka really kind of mentions briefly in the episode that I think is a point that she makes that I think is actually very poignant, which is, had the wrongful death lawsuit been handled properly in 1985, I believe is when it happened, there would have been a more attempt for closure for both sides. Because, she says in the piece that, Snuka's family, I guess, didn't want him to advise him against essentially participating in this wrongful death suit, where he didn't really show up, he didn't pay his attorney, and he filed for bankruptcy, and they didn't, and the Argentino family didn't get any of the $500,000. That again causes like this story to not be dealt with in a way. And I think that for both sides, for Nancy's family and also for Jimmy, that this became something that just was unresolved for so long. And I think that's part of the reason why when something like this remains that unresolved, we tend to look at, every little corner and every little thing. And, because this isn't a story that, that has a definitive answer. And so I think for them, it's been a very challenging and emotionally exhausting experience. One of the things I do also know is just that this obviously destroyed the Argentino family. And, not only the lack of cooperation they felt with from the authorities all throughout this case, and then to actually see that the magnitude of these documents that were used against, to get the charges filed against Jimmy, 30 years after the fact. I mean, it's just, to have to be constantly, to live through this and have to be reminded of this. And then, of course, it's like what Luis Argentino says in the show when she says that she still feels like Nancy's calling out to her, for justice. It's like, that is just a very heavy, sad thing. And it's like at the end of the day, like this is about a woman, that lost her life, and that's what this story really is about. It's not about someone's legacy. It's about that,
No, for sure. And I just, your heart goes out to him because clearly it just feels like something was amiss and maybe it just wasn't a priority. How much of that is based on the celebrity aspect, do you think? I mean, in terms of, it feels like, what we see online, people say, oh, celebrities can get away with anything. Do you think that this was a quote unquote good old boy system, or is it just people sort of giving him a pass because he was a quote unquote celebrity? Or do you think legitimately everyone did the best that they could at the time, which given what we know now feels very, very unlikely?
Well, the one thing I'll say is that, just to first talk about the celebrity aspect of it, one of the things that, one has to question is literally, is there an influence of celebrity on, the police that are investigating this at the time? One interesting thing that I'm going to pull up here is from Jimmy's statement to the police, which is, it takes place at 9 a.m. On May 11th. So this is hours after, Nancy's passed away, and they interview Jimmy in the motel room. And here there is evidence that suggests that the authorities are at least familiar with who some of these characters are, from who they are on television. And that just begs the question if that did have any influence on it. So, for example, one of the detective asks Jimmy during the interview, he says, "Do you work with the promoter, Jim? Is that how this wrestling thing goes?" Jimmy says, "Yes." "Is he here at the motel today?" the detective asks. Jimmy says, "He's probably at the TV, Vince McMahon." And then the actual authorities, the detectives say, "Vince McMahon, the announcer, the young guy?" And Jimmy says, "Yeah, that's the son. The father's usually there too." And then, so that, they know he's the announcer on the program. And then the detective says, "Is the guy that wears the turban and screams and hollers around, is he at the motel today, whatever his name is?" And then Jimmy says, most of the guys stay here and some of them stay up in the other side. Like today, for instance, making TV up there. And then the detective asks, are these guys all friends of yours in reality? And you just go and do whatever you have to do in the ring, or don't you socialize with these people? And then Jimmy says, no, I'm usually just with my girl. Yeah, we travel along together. So it shows that at least the detective is familiar with the Iron Sheik, which is interesting, you know?
This is all so weird. Is that not weird just to read out loud?
Yeah, it is, definitely. Well, one of the things that's weird is just that, you know, looking through these files, I mean, there are police interviews with Don Morocco, Mr. Fuji, Howard Finkel, you know, and it's just compelling as a wrestling fan or anyone to really just like think like, here's these guys who portray these kind of cartoon characters on television, and now they're all wrapped up in a murder investigation. You know, it's a very bizarre thing.
Perhaps almost as bizarre as Snuka including a story about Nancy in his book. And you saw Nancy's family's reaction, you know, when he basically says, Nancy ruined my life. Mm-hmm. It's just really remarkable that he included that, but also included in the book is the story of Vince coming to talk to the police on his behalf. And you guys examined that a little bit, and it's pointed out that there's not a lot of documentation about that. And of course, wrestling fans online have sort of jumped to conclusions. Had you heard that story beforehand? And do you think it should have been explored more, or is that really as thorough as we can get?
Yeah. So, we asked the Allentown, the morning call reporters about that. And, you know, because it really is a conspiracy theory, I think, born out of Jimmy Snuka's book, you know, because basically he says in his book, he says, quote, all I remember is McMahon had a briefcase with him, unquote. And when we asked Kevin Ammerman, who appears in this show, obviously he writes for the morning call. He says in the interview, this is a transcript from his interview that we did with him. He says, I don't even believe that. I don't believe that happened. I have, and referring to, you know, what people talk about with Vince and the briefcase. I have no reason to believe. It's weird Jimmy brought that up. It's almost his fault for letting people think that, because he brought it up in his autobiography. I think that there would be speculation either way when someone comes to a meeting like that and does all the talking, but, you know, the whole suitcase thing threw a lot of people. It made people think that there was something that I don't think there was. I have no indication that there was any kind of payout or anything. People have asked me that since day one, since the day the story ran, and I have no evidence of that at all. So I want to be real clear about that. And again, similarly, there's no evidence to suggest, you know, anything like that transpired.
It's, you know, it is the thing in wrestling where there's a lot of mistrust and people are wanting to sort of look and sort of see the angle. And I think that the volume was maybe amplified last night when Nancy's family said that, quote unquote, Jimmy's promoter kept calling. Were you guys sort of taken aback when they revealed that piece of the story?
Well, definitely. Yeah, definitely. Yeah. What
do you make of Jimmy showing up to the funeral in a tank top and shorts and flip flops?
Yeah, it's not a good look. And, you know, the interesting thing about that is, you know, that's also another really pivotal point of the story when you look at it, because it's a moment when that's the moment when the family starts to question, you know, because they learn, you know, from the mortician or whatever that, you know, they had to really cover up these bruises, you know, and they had to cover up this because they were showing through the makeup. And that's a really disturbing detail. And then the other thing that's about the funeral is that, you know, Jimmy came for that service, but he actually didn't show up for the following day, or I think he was the following day or the second day, I can't remember, but he didn't show up for the actual burial. And that was really that whole couple of days was when the Argentino family, I think, start to look at him in a different way, because I do believe that they did believe his story of it being an accident up until that point. And then they started to really question it. And that's when they started to look into it. And when they weren't getting anywhere with the authorities, and after the authorities had told them that they're not going to, prosecute or charge or whatever, they said, that's when they started to look in other avenues on their own, which of course was, I'm sure, a very fatiguing process to try and investigate such a thing at the time.
Well, Jason, what else is there to say about this story? It feels like we could probably do 3 or 4 more of these, just sort of breaking down the ins and outs. But
yeah,
I do think maybe we should mention this too, Evan.
Mm-hmm.
We learned a lot. I learned a lot from the Chris Benoit show you guys did about David Benoit and how all of this had such a negative effect on him. And obviously she wasn't included in the documentary last night, but Jimmy Snuka has a daughter in the wrestling business who's under contract to WWE. And I feel bad for Nancy's family, and I feel bad for Snuka's widow, but sort of conspicuous by her absence for obvious reasons. I feel bad for Tamina today because this can't be something that's easy to watch as a family member, right?
No. And I think if what we learn, if anything really is to be learned from our Benoit episodes and how, this does affect family members, I think that I just hope that, wrestling fans or people, anyone online, and I've been seeing a lot of, people talk about, just being respectful and how you do talk about it. Because, not every, just like with David Benoit, he's innocent in this, and he's not, the sins of his father and, that type of thing. And I just hope that people can kind of, that was one of the main themes that we explored in the Benoit episode. And I think that should be, applied here as well. And I just hope that people can be respectful.
Yeah, I think that's something that needs to be said, because obviously she did nothing here and she's in a terrible spot now. And it's a weird story. Jason, what's the takeaway? Anything we can add to here? I don't really know how to transition from such a wild story here.
Yeah. Like one of the things for me that, I struggle with this episode is I wish there was like more opportunity and more time to talk about Nancy's life, and that there were more people to speak for Nancy and tell stories about her. But, her life was cut like so short at like the age of like 23. Her life ends there. And there's so much life that, that could have been there for people to talk about. And so, we tried our best to paint a picture of Nancy and who she was like as a person. But I just can't help but think, I just wish there was more. I just wish, there was more to her story, and her story didn't have to end this way.
Yeah. And And that was one of the intentions of the episode. And as well as I know when the Morning Call reporters covered the story, was really to kind of, show really who Nancy was. And, there was great stories that the sisters had of growing up with Nancy and, going to all of the, amazing Manhattan nightclubs at the time. And, and I know that was something we really wanted to try and work in there. But yeah, and it's just, it's so tragic just in terms of the life cut short, and just imagining being that age, that young amidst all of this, is also just a very sobering thought. But it was important to us, at least in the episode last night, to end it on, really being about her, because this story is about her.
It's a great photograph that you guys have that obviously, the family provided and that you used. You can just, I don't know, she seems full of life and like such a young, energetic, hopeful, optimistic person from the photo. As many nice words as you can drape over the photo, and then to know that, she lost her life this way is just, it's hard to imagine. It's hard to reconcile. And, this is a weird question, Jason, but you've been a wrestling fan your whole life. And and now you're going and sort of examining some of these horrible things that have happened in and around wrestling. How do you reconcile that with your wrestling fandom?
That's a good question. I guess it's kind of like how, I'm a fan of a lot of things. I'm definitely, I'm a big wrestling fan. I'm also like a very big fan of cinema as well, which also has a very complicated history as well too. And with some filmmakers that I grew up loving as well. And, now I've been exploring the past few years, the histories of some of the wrestlers I grew up liking and, maybe finding some questionable history in their past. So it's, it's like a sobering experience. It really makes you, I guess, I don't know, just realize that like all these people involved are people. Sometimes we put them up on a pedestal, but in real life, a lot of these stories that we cover are like real things that other people go through. It's not just like in the wrestling world. And I think, there's a lot of people who could see this story with Nancy and maybe see some similarities in other stories within their lives as well too. That, this is not just something that's happening in the wrestling world. This is something that's happening to thousands of people like every day. So yeah, I think through the lens of like researching these wrestlers and their pasts, it lends a perspective on, just human life and what happens between people.
How about you, Evan?
Yeah, I mean, this show, the experience of making this show, now that we've done 16 of these, has shown me a lot. It's shown me, obviously I grew up, since I was 5 years old, I've been a wrestling fan. And I echo Jason's statements too, in terms of, film history is wrought with a lot of awful stories as well. And it doesn't hamper my opinion and my enjoyment of movies, more broadly. And I think if you look into any history of entertainment or otherwise, you're going to find stories of tragedy, and you're going to find stories of injustice, and those types of things. I think wrestling will always be compelling to me, because, wrestling, because of the blurred lines aspect of wrestling, the reality versus fiction, and how that tends to, find its way into some of these stories is always going to be compelling to me, even outside of being a fan. I don't think it's hampered my opinion, obviously, of maybe some of the legacies of the people that we've covered. It's changed that a little bit, but my love for wrestling as an art form and as a form of entertainment has never subsided. In fact, I find it more fascinating probably in different ways.
Yeah, I agree.
And can look at it in a different way. But, and I think that's something very important to us in making that show. And I know we've talked about it on other episodes of this podcast before, but, we do approach this show, from the fandom aspect as well. Like, our love for this, is it's all, maybe you see that conflicted, like seeing us being a little conflicted in watching the episode, in terms of showing what we love about the sport and then showing things that aren't necessarily, great, but yeah, we definitely do always, in making these episodes, try and lead with our passion for wrestling, because we are passionate about wrestling.
Yeah.
And passionate about telling these stories, and we'll continue to always be fascinated by them.
Well, we're fascinated by what you guys are doing next week. I don't even know how we're going to follow this episode. I think this is easily one of the best ones that you guys have ever done. Next week, it's Dino Bravo, another murder. Jason, what do we have in store for Dino Bravo? What should fans look forward to and expect to learn about Dino and his untimely death?
Yeah, so we spent actually, I guess you could say, like 2 years working on this episode. It was an episode that we started shooting on season 1, when we told the story before, but when our season 1 episode numbers got cut down, we had to shelve this episode for a bit. But we were really glad in a sense that we did, because it gave us more opportunity to get a couple more subjects involved in the story. We were able to get Dino Bravo's widow to tell her story.
Really for the first time ever.
Yeah, for the first time. Yeah,
on camera.
It's a story about Dino Bravo, who was a very famous wrestler from Montreal, Quebec in the 80s. And when Vince McMahon was going around buying up the different territories, and he picked up the Montreal territory, he brought in a bunch of those performers into the WWE, one being Dino Bravo, and where he spent like a number of years wrestling. And then after he was let go from the company, he ended up getting involved into some organized crime in Montreal, which is led to led to his assassination one night, where his wife and daughter came home one night from ballet classes to find Dino dead in their living room. And so, we did our best to unpack that history and interviewed those who were closest involved with the story.
Yeah, it's like Jason said, it's a 2-year journey for us. It's an episode that we worked pretty hard on during season 1 in terms of just a lot of the interviews and trying to gain a lot of access. And I'm sure we'll talk about some folks that didn't participate and on the show on this podcast next week. And I'm sure we'll also talk about the challenges of making that episode as well, because even though this happened back in the early 90s when he was killed, it's still an open case. So when you're dealing with an open case, there's only so much information that's available to you. But it was important to us to talk about the legacy of Dino Bravo. Again, this is somebody who wrestling fans may casually remember, from some of the early 90s and mid to late 80s, pay-per-views on some of the earlier matches on the cards. But I think a lot of people will see that he had a rich history in the 1970s and was a huge star in Montreal, and really has a whole nother, there's a whole nother legacy there in terms of his career. And I think this episode is also interesting because it does examine the consequences of a life after wrestling. Here's somebody who, made a handsome income, when he was working with the WWF, and when that time ran out, there was no real backup plan. And we kind of examine the unfortunate, paths he took after wrestling. And it kind of looks into the consequences of that. And I think for a lot of people, it's interesting to see when we post online, which stories are you most excited about seeing? A lot of people are really interested in seeing this story, mainly because I don't think it's really been covered that much before. So hopefully our investigation into that will satisfy the most hardcore of fan.
Stay tuned next week. Dark Side of the Ring. It's Tuesday nights, 10 o'clock Eastern on Vice, channel 271 on DirecTV. And then the following Wednesday, of course, you can count on us recapping everything that didn't make air. It's been fun, man. I'm looking forward to next week. Dino Bravo. Stay tuned.
Yep.
We'll see you right here on Dark Side of the Podcast. I've been telling you for a long time that SaveWithConrad.com can save you money, but don't take my word for it.
Now, James, what made you come to Save with Conrad in the first place?
I needed a refi. I've been listening to Conrad's show for a couple of years. It was very, it was very competitive with what I was seeing locally and with my current lender. So I just decided to throw my business at Conrad.
Was there anything specific that Conrad said on the shows that kind of made you take that first step?
Interest rates are historically low, and 2 months without a mortgage payment seemed a really good deal.
Off the top of your head, how much money were you able to save through Save with Conrad?
Man, I don't know what the overall savings is going to be. I needed to cash out to cover some other outstanding debts, and the rate I was able to drop the rate down by almost a point, and basically keep my same payment but cash out enough to cover those outstanding debts and have a little left over for a rainy day.
Oh, that's great.
It's pouring down rain here.
Would you recommend Save with Conrad to any of your friends or family?
Oh, sure.
So what are you waiting for? Find out how much money you can save right now for free. You don't need perfect credit or money out of your pocket. Even credit scores in the 500s can be approved. And if we can't save you money, we won't waste your time. But because we're licensed in more than 40 states, we can help more families than ever before. Find out how much money you can save right now for free at SaveWithConrad.com. Oh, and did I mention you could skip your next 2 house payments? Hurry to SaveWithConrad.com.
Hey, it's Conrad Thompson. Thanks for checking out the podcast here on YouTube. Be sure to hit the subscribe button and the notifications bell so you get a notice anytime we upload some new content. And go save yourself some money right now. If you're in a 30-year loan or you have credit card debt, it's not a matter of if I can save you money. It's a matter of how much. Find out right now for free at SaveWithConrad.com.